Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to Reporters, France 24's eye on the big stories around the world. In this edition, we've been back to Rwanda 2 decades after the genocide. 800,000 men, women and children were slaughtered, Rwandans killing Rwandans. But the tribal divide marked that killing. Most of the dead were Tutsis and also some Hutus who opposed the violence. And it was the Hutus who carried out the killing. Well, France has just heard its first trial of a Rwandan now convicted of his role in the genocide. And the repercussions of this atrocity continue to be far-reaching. Pauline Siwane has been looking at the roots of the genocide and has met people who survived it and talked of the legacy that they are now living with.
It's an arresting sight. Human skulls in the middle of a church. In Rwanda, bones are often on show at the very same locations where these people were slaughtered. In 1994, between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed in the space of just 100 days. Most of them were Tutsis, massacred because of their ethnicity. Hutus who openly opposed the murders often met the same fate. An inter-ethnic genocide that has its roots in Rwanda's colonial past. Impressed by the Tutsi elite and their monarchy, Belgian colonizers favoured this group for positions of authority.
They were considered as more intelligent, more elegant, better at organizing and giving orders. So, within the context of a colonial economy, as well as for the evangelical missionaries, the Tutsi became an ally, the perfect go-between.
To create capable middlemen, education was essential, but only Tutsi children were sent to school.
As for the Hutus, well, they weren't thought of as that smart, but capable of hard work. So, 2 racial categories were practically institutionalized through the ID card, through bloodlines. The child of a Tutsi was a Tutsi, the child of a Hutu, a Hutu.
But just before Rwandan independence, Belgium changed its mind, switching its support to the Hutu majority who'd risen up against their colonizers in what was called the Social Revolution of 1959. At the time, Hutus made up 85% of the population. Hutus gained control and the first Tutsi killings began, forcing many to seek refuge in neighbouring countries. This diaspora was to form the basis for the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front in Uganda 2 decades later. Those who remained in Rwanda were treated as second-class citizens, and their access to education was limited. Thousands joined the RPF.
We were arrested because we were Tutsis, and we were accused of undermining national security. We spent between 5 and 6 months in prison. That was really a major factor in my decision to fight in the war.
The RPF launched their first offensive at the end of 1990. Rebels attacked the north of Rwanda from neighbouring Uganda. Paul Kagame, the country's current president, was one of the commanders. With tensions rising, the government-backed Interahamwe militia, soon to play a central role in the genocide, began to target Tutsis. Working hand in hand with the army, the Interahamwe was developing the methods of extermination.
In the Kibungo prefecture, the regional supervisor asked for permission to fire 2 of the Doctors Without Borders staff because she believed they were militiamen and that they were terrorizing other people. They're the people who came to our health center, so we could see that the political situation was hotting up.
As the situation deteriorated, Paris lent its support to the Hutu-led government. French President François Mitterrand was close to his Rwandan counterpart, Juvénal Habyarimana. France sent arms to the regime and provided training and support for the Rwandan military as it fought to repel the Tutsi offensive.
When I arrived in July 1993, I saw that the French army had been deployed, and they were very visible. On the main roads coming out of Kigali, there were plenty of French soldiers working with the Rwandan army to check people's ID. But it didn't come out of the blue. It was already well known that Tutsi pogroms had taken place a number of times in the country between 1990 and 93. But the French involvement, yes, I was shocked. Shocked politically and morally to see my country take the stance that it did.
At the end of 1993, hope of a peaceful resolution arrived in the form of 2,500 UN peacekeepers sent as part of the Arusha peace agreements. The accords signed in Tanzania stipulated that power must be shared between the Hutu administration and the Tutsi rebels from the RPF. But the agreements were never applied. On the contrary, the newly created Radio des Mille Collines began to whip up anti-Tutsi sentiment. In this explosive atmosphere, all that was needed was a spark, and it duly came. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, crashing into the gardens of the presidential palace. Habyarimana had just pledged to respect the Arusha agreements. Whether Hutu extremists or the RPF were behind the attack is still up for debate 20 years on. The touch paper had been lit. The genocide itself had already been long planned. Roadblocks were put in place. The massacres began.
On the radio, they said it was the Tutsis who murdered him. So we encouraged the local people to go out and massacre the Tutsis, to take their valuables and seize their properties.
Colonel Theoneste Bagosora, mastermind of the genocide, became the strongman at the head of the country. Over the following 3 months, some 10,000 people were slaughtered every day. Not even children were spared the horror.
It was almost the Easter holidays, so I thought, I'm going to take the children to my sister's, because that was in the eastern province, in Kibungo. We went there and we spent Easter together. Then I came back to Kigali on my own to go back to work on Easter Monday.
Lainey escaped execution when a Rwandan officer saved her life, yet just days later her cousin had to break the news that her 3 children, aged 9, 6 and 3, had all been killed.
At 8 in the morning, the militiamen came. They went at them with machetes. They gunned them down. I can't tell you. I was thinking, why am I not dying? Why can't I just die right now? I sat down. I didn't even want to go back into the house. I just thought, I'll sit down right here. That was when they told me. My family and my children were dead. I don't know what to tell you. I just stopped living.
Many of the UN peacekeepers in Rwanda left at the beginning of the genocide, following the murder of 10 Belgian paramilitaries. Romeo Dallaire was the commander in the UN MINUSMA mission. He stayed on with just 200 soldiers. His requests for reinforcements fell upon deaf ears. The Tutsi rebels from the RPF were alone then in their attacks on the regime. They concentrated their efforts on the capital, Kigali.
As soon as we started to advance, we were just climbing over bodies, corpses everywhere. I remember when we arrived in Kigali, in Nyanza, there were just loads of them, loads of bodies, thousands piled up. I can't honestly say that we cried, but it was like the apocalypse. Everyone was just expecting to die from one moment to the next.
We saw an ethnic group disappear entirely. Day after day it happened so quickly. At the time, we said, a little provocatively perhaps, you can't stop a genocide with doctors. But it got to the point where we were calling for military intervention. Not a neutral intervention, but military action against the perpetrators of the genocide. For us, the objective was simply to help people survive.
When you see people being attacked like that, murders, why couldn't the UN forces who were armed, why couldn't they protect us? They were even killing babies. It's just unbelievable.
Almost 3 months after the atrocities began, France launched a military and humanitarian intervention in Rwanda. At the end of June 1994, French soldiers were deployed to the southwest, but many in Rwanda looked askance at France's Opération Turquoise, recalling Paris's alliance with the Hutu regime. The mission may have saved civilian lives, but it also allowed many of the perpetrators of the genocide to flee, crossing into neighbouring Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Just days after Opération Turquoise was launched, RPF forces captured Kigali, ending the genocide. Commander Paul Kagame became the de facto leader. Yet criticism was swiftly levelled at both camps, with some accusing the RPF of committing war crimes too.
What I saw was not only revenge against the Hutus, but I also saw Tutsis murdered by the FPR. Some officers had a certain background. I mean, they had rid themselves of all humanity in their hearts. They were actually killing because they enjoyed it.
Once the RPF had established itself in power, Ben Rutabana, an opposition supporter, was jailed by those who were once his brothers in arms. Then he was forced to leave the country. 4 years after the genocide, a French parliamentary commission began to examine what part France had played in Rwanda. The Kiles report flagged up certain irregularities.
In July 1994, I asked François Mitterrand this question in Cochin. Did France continue to supply arms to the Rwandan National Army? His response was very mysterious. Do you believe, he said to me, that on the morning of the 7th of April, the world woke up and said, today is when the genocide starts? This notion of genocide only really came about a few weeks after the 7th of April 1994. That is all he said to me.
The report concluded by exonerating Paris from any responsibility for the killings.
What would be reasonable is that if, 20 years later, the French state and its leaders open up the archives of the then administration, of the military, and have those civil servants who were involved, have them testify. Because there's still a question mark hanging over some serious issues.
20 years later, those question marks still remain, most of all for the survivors of the atrocities of those months in 1994, when almost 90% of the Rwandan Tutsi population was wiped out.
Our reporter Pauline Simonet is here in the studio. Pauline, thank you very much for that look back at the Rwandan genocide and horrific period it clearly was. And that statistic, 70% of people killed, it's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yes, 70% and maybe even more, because some specialists think that more than 80% to 90% of the Tutsis who were living in Rwanda were killed in 1994. Actually, all the statistics, all the figures linked to that genocide are terrifying. It's the fastest genocide ever. In 100 days, only 3 months, around 1 million people killed. That's indeed terrifying. But 20 years after the genocide, I've talked to many survivors here in Europe or also in Rwanda, and they still have that question. They don't understand why the international community abandoned the Rwandan people, the Tutsi people who were living there in 1994, why they were abandoned by the international community, because at that time there were signs, there were people who told the international community that something really bad was going on. Members of NGOs, diplomats were saying something big is coming, you have to do something, but no one wanted to intervene. We've talked about France in the report, who was really close to the Hutu regime at that period, but also the United States of America, they didn't do anything. And why? Also because at the end of '93, there was this Restore Hope operation in Somalia that led to the death of at least 20 American soldiers in Somalia. So they didn't want to intervene, they didn't want to do anything in Africa. So that's why the United States didn't want to mention that there was a genocide going on there. So 20 years after, there's still the survivors don't understand what happened.
How do Tutsis and Hutus live together now, 20 years on?
Actually, after the genocide, the new authorities, the new president, Paul Kagame, decided to ban ethnicities. So they're no longer Hutus, no longer Tutsis. They're no longer Hutus and Tutsis in the identity cards. So they don't exist anymore, Hutus and Tutsis. We are all Rwanda, one nation. That's the message of Paul Kagame.
That's in theory. Does that work?
That's in theory. But of course, reconciliation, it's a longer process. Of course, all the Rwandans that have more than 20 years, they know who is Hutu, who is Tutsi. They know who killed his brother, his mother. But the good thing is that for the children, the people who are under 20 years of age, some of them, most of them, I'd say, don't know if they are Hutus and Tutsi. But there is a problem. That's for Rwanda. But for the rest of the region, let's talk about Eastern Congo. Ethnic divide, it's still an issue. Because, you know, there have been several wars, several rebellions, supported officially or not by Paul Kagame. And the resentment, the political resentment against Paul Kagame escalated into a resentment against the whole Tutsi population based in Eastern Congo.
It is very difficult. We have very little time. Tell us where justice is in all this. Is it happening?
Justice, actually, there are different places where Rwandan accused of genocide have been tried. First of all, in Rwanda, 2 million Rwandan people have been judged in Rwanda by the Gacaca. It's local courts, traditional courts. But then for the political leaders, the high-rank officers, those people have been judged in Arusha in Tanzania by the International Tribunal. And so around 70 of them. And this court should close at the end of this year. And then all around the world, some nation decided to judge Rwandan accused of genocide in their own country, in Belgium and France.
So very much an ongoing situation. Pauline Simonet, we need to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much indeed for your report and your analysis. Pauline Simonet, our reporter this week. Thank you for watching. You can see it again via France24.com. Stay with us.